research. The prior session ended with the notion of the difficulty of communicating across groups. This session will certainly keep that theme going, but it's all about building, or in this case, rebuilding, a fearless organization. My emphasis will be on psychological safety as mission critical to enabling effective teamwork for safe, high quality care. Let's get started. I think the reason I'm here today is very likely due to a landmark study at Google. Now, I had been studying psychological safety for many years, actually about 17, when this study came along, but Google brought it to the main stage. Google set out to explain performance differences among 180 different teams over several years. They put every variable they could possibly think of into the model. And guess what explained the variance in performance? You guessed it, psychological safety. This is Julia Rozovsky, a PhD psychologist who ran the study. And they had an open mind, to be sure, and they were surprised. When Julia and her colleagues encountered the concept of psychological safety, put it in their model, it was as if everything fell into place. This is a quote from the New York Times Magazine article that got a lot of attention and started creating a great deal of attention to psychological safety. But why, right? Why might it be the case that this variable explained persistent performance differences across teams at Google? Famously smart people, well selected, competitive to get a job there, just like the work that all of you do, likely better paid. Nonetheless, why? Well, I think it's because most people, including them, underestimate the subtle nature of interpersonal risk. Let's face it, nobody wakes up in the morning and jumps out of bed because they just can't wait to get to work today to look ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, or negative, right? No, of course not. All of us would far prefer to look capable, helpful, positive, competent, and so we tend to hold back. If I don't want to look ignorant, it's easy. Just don't ask questions. I don't want to look incompetent. Don't admit weaknesses or mistakes. Don't offer ideas. Don't critique the status quo. I think you can all readily recognize that when people hold back with these important workplace communication behaviors, the patients are at risk. But you also must recognize how absolutely second nature this is. So this is why psychological safety, which is a weird state, it's a state in which you feel you can do these things. Let me give you my formal definition. It's a belief, it's a climate variable that is captured by the belief that the environment is safe for interpersonal risks, like speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, and even mistakes. I'm not saying everybody will be thrilled, but they will be appreciative, right? That is what we do around here. You can think of it, perhaps as the shortest way to say it, as felt permission for candor. Now, in the aftermath of the Google study and all of the attention that got and all of the digital articles out there, there have been many, many misconceptions about what this really is. So I want to set the record straight here with this definition. Not at odds with high standards or accountability. More on that later. But the bottom line here, literally and figuratively, is that psychological safety isn't the goal. Psychological safety is a means to the goal. What's the goal? Well, safe, high-quality care. Now, I developed a measure in my early research that robustly captures this sense across work groups in organizations. The essential dimensions of the measure are on this slide. I won't go into great detail. given our time. But there's essentially beliefs about whether your team, your work environment is inclusive, especially of people with different viewpoints, whether your team is willing to help, whether there's a kind of healthy attitude about taking risks and failing, especially in novel territory, whether you have open conversations. So I've used that measure, and many, many other researchers have as well, in workplaces around the world, a growing number of them in healthcare delivery. Let me tell you about just one study that I did with a couple of PhD students, Ingrid Nemhard and Anita Tucker, back in the day. This was a study of neonatal intensive care units. 23 of them, all involved in an improvement collaborative. So all 23 of these across the US and Canada were actively engaged in quality improvement projects, much like IHI's collaboratives, but this was called the Vermont Oxford Network. Now, we studied them. We did a lot of observation, a lot of interviews, and of course, a survey. The first thing that jumps out the results of the survey is that there are statistically significant differences across role groups. Think about this, whether this might be true in your environment. So for physicians, compared to nurses, compared to respiratory therapists in this very specialized setting, the degree to which people believed their voice was welcome differed. Not surprising. I admit to you, that was hypothesis one. But this is what did surprise us. When we looked carefully at these data, we discovered that this role-based psychological safety gap was not consistent across units. In fact, in some of the NICUs, the psychological safety across role groups was absolutely flat, no difference at all. That meant, of course, by the way, flat and high, it turns out. So two questions immediately come to mind, right? Question number one, does it matter? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. 3 years into the quality improvement work, those with the flat, high psychological safety pattern had an 18% improvement in morbidity and mortality compared to the others. Okay, question two. What explains the difference? And that is what I will spend much of this talk explaining. The short answer is inclusive leadership. Medical directors, in this case, with inviting others' input and more. So let's take a look. Now, some very recent research with another doctoral student looked at this question of speaking up about near misses. What a great source of learning, of data, near misses are. The problem is, or the challenge is, the near miss can be viewed as a failure, right? There was a mistake, something went wrong. It also, of course, can be viewed as a success, right? Good catch, nothing bad happened. So what we found here, and we created a set of vignettes, a set of triggers for people to respond to in an oncology ward, oncology team at UCLA. We created a set of triggers from standard care all the way down to adverse event. And with each additional scenario here, the event gets slightly closer to problematic care, slightly closer to an actual adverse event. Now, here's what we found in research. The degree to which it was close to harm, the event, the trigger event was close to harm, made near misses feel more threatening and thus more challenging to speak up about. The more threatening the message, that meant the more psychological safety affected reporting behavior. So psychological safety matters more, right? It's less important if you have something to say that's not threatening, but it matters more for reporting an event that underscores vulnerability rather than one that about people in the apathy zone where they quit and stay. And sure, if all you worried about was psychological safety, you might be at risk of creating inadvertently a comfort zone where we feel very comfortable speaking up, but we don't work very hard. I don't see much of that in healthcare delivery today. In fact, I never really did. Very rare. But this is the one I've seen a lot of. I call it the anxiety zone, but it's more accurate to call it the interpersonal anxiety zone. This is where those respiratory therapists were working in those lower performing, lower improving intensive care units. This is the gold standard. This is where we're trying to be. High standards, high psychological safety. I call it the learning zone, but it's just as accurate to call it the agile teaming zone. We need to team up to deliver safe, high quality care. You know that. And you know it's challenging. I'm going to ask you 3 rhetorical questions on this slide, and the answer for all 3 will be the same. 1, how do you care for patients who show up with varied, urgent medical challenges in an emergency department? 2, how do you make an award-winning animated film, say at Pixar or Disney, that requires computer science, storytelling, acting, marketing, and so much more? All this teaming across boundaries. There, I gave it away. And finally, how do you rescue 33 miners trapped 700 meters below some of the hardest rock in the world in a race against time because they barely have enough food to feed 10 men for 3 days? So the answer to all 3 questions is teaming, a kind of robust coordination and collaboration across boundaries, disciplinary shift, and more to get complex dynamic work done. Not easy. What can you do to make that work better? Well, 3 simple things, right? None of them are easy. Simple doesn't mean easy. But 1, and this is so important in your context, frequently, even though you think it is obvious and a given, frequently call attention to the organization's purpose. Create opportunities for people to get together and share their thinking, and that you have every day on the wards. Frame diverse views as a resource. They are a resource that help us do problem solving in support of that mission. And then finally, create forums where people can build mutual understanding and empathy. This would be a good example of that. And build psychological safety. And here are the 3 things. One takes a little explaining, the other 2 are fairly straightforward. One takes a little explaining, the other 2 are fairly straightforward. So framing the work means, just as you had to frame near misses as opportunities for learning and resilience rather than for failure and shame, you're always in the business of overriding spontaneous cognitive frames as a leader and as a team member. Same thing. To reframe the work for learning, what you're trying to do is build shared meaning about what's valued, right? Candor is valued around here. And you want to remind people that the person on each side of them may have a crucial piece of the puzzle that we need to fulfill our mission. Let me give you an example, kind of a playful one. This is David Kelly, the co-founder and then longtime CEO of IDEO, arguably the world's most celebrated innovation firm. And David will routinely say things like this: a leader saying fail often? Really? Yes, of course. But you already know where I'm going with this. This is the kind of work they do. What he's saying is, if you want to be a great innovator, you've got to be willing to fail along the way. Why does it even need to be said? Because frankly, he's hiring straight A students who have never failed along the way. So he's got to really reframe what good looks like so they'll be willing to do it. As you can tell from this example, framing is context specific. I would not advise you to leave this conference and go out quoting David Kelly in your attempt to frame the work. Do not say, hey, everybody, hey, clinicians, fail often. No, of course not. David can do that because he's on the right here. So some work is very well understood, very routine, like in an automotive assembly line. Some work is well understood, but still variable, complex, and uncertain, as in much of the care delivery process. And finally, some work is just pure innovation, right? We don't even know where to begin sometimes. As we move to the right, uncertainty goes up. What does that mean? Well, it means failure goes up, right? And so people have to be emotionally prepared for that and understand what that means for them. Now, given that you're roughly speaking in the middle, let's take a leader closer to home. Many of you may know Julie Morath. She was the protagonist in a case study I wrote at Children's Minnesota way back. She was a pioneer in the patient safety movement, and she was known for walking around that hospital as its COO, saying over and over again, what we do, healthcare, by its very nature, is a complex, error-prone system. Think Swiss cheese, right? Why is she saying that? She's framing the work. When she came on board, the frame was, when something went wrong, there's a culprit. There's someone to blame. Let's find him. Instead, she said, complex systems will, by their very nature, break down. Therefore, those who are speaking up are heroes. They're saving lives, right? This is a total reframe of what so many took for granted way back at the beginning of this patient safety movement. And finally, just to be complete in terms of the assembly line setting, this is Fujio Cho, who was for a good long time chairman of Toyota Worldwide, famous learning organization. But back in the very first Toyota plant created in North America, owned and run by Toyota, he was the plant manager back then. And there's a marvelous story about another manager who came to, younger manager, came to the Friday senior staff meetings and started giving a report of the many successes he had had that week. Finally, he realized that Mr. Cho, plant manager, was staring at him. I could see he was puzzled, says this manager, and puzzled. Why is this leader puzzled when a junior manager is boasting? Well, it's normal behavior in most organizations. So he said, Jim-san, we know you're a good manager or we wouldn't have hired you, but please talk to us about your problems so we can work on them together. Utter reframe, right? Problems are a team sport. We understand and expect that your successes are happening nearly every day, most of the day. This is a routine production operation after all. But please don't use the valuable time of your colleagues to talk about that. Tell us about your problems. Total reframe, right? So that's framing the work. This one's pretty straightforward. Inviting engagement means go out of your way to ask good questions, right? What's a good question? Well, a good question is one that focuses us on some topic at hand, something that matters, and by its wording, it gives people room to respond, right? What do others think? Who has a different perspective? Notice how that lowers the bar for speaking up. If I say, does anyone have a different perspective? So, I don't know. Does anyone? Oh, nope, guess not. But who has it implies it's there. I just don't know where. The other kind that are good questions are to deepen. Help us walk us through your thinking. What's the concern you have? Can you give us an example? What might happen if? Right? Just helping unveil the thoughtful voice of your colleagues. And finally, let's say you framed the work as the kind of work that is mission critical for others' voice. You've invited it proactively through good questions. Let's say someone brings you bad news. Respond productively, please. What does that mean? Let's say someone calls you, a colleague, maybe a nurse in the middle of the night with a question. Let's say you happen to think when you hear that question, that's a stupid question. Let's just say, right? What do you say? You know the answer already. You say, thank you so much for calling. That's a productive response. Why? It's appreciative and forward-looking. It recognizes the shadow of the future. Let me give you another example. Another automotive example, in fact. This is Alan Mullally, who led a phenomenal turnaround at Ford Motor Company a few years back. And with his senior team, talk to me about your problems. They weren't doing that. They were only sharing good news. Finally, he really put his fist down and said, what isn't going well? We're losing $17 billion. Mark Fields raised a very serious problem, and Alan responds, Mark, thank you for that clear line of sight. How can we help? What a marvelous response. I call it productive because it's appreciative. It's not Pollyanna. It's not fake. It's not saying, hey, Mark, that's great. It isn't great. It's really bad news. But he is saying, thanks for that clear line of sight, which is an honest statement. How can we help? Problem solving is a team sport. And as Mullally put it in an interview with Business Week, he said, you've got to make honest feedback a positive experience. This is true for team leaders, for medical directors, and for members of any clinical team. Got to make honesty positive because it isn't naturally. The red is a gem. Problem solving is a team sport. You have to demonstrate that you welcome it. Let me give you an example from one of my studies of cardiac surgery teams learning a new minimally invasive technology for surgery. And an anesthetist told us in an interview, there was early on in this process, there was a moment where an RN, registered nurse, dropped a vein graft on the floor. She spoke up immediately, and the surgeon didn't say a word. He just made another incision. Maybe a millisecond was lost. No yelling, no screaming. He didn't need to. She knew she'd made a mistake. That is a productive response, humane and forward-looking. So building psychological safety, this is a summary of those three behaviors. Doing the work is really a stance of humility. Right? It's a stance of recognizing we don't yet have all the answers. We are not working in Henry Ford's old assembly plant. We are humble about what's coming at us at all times. We make that clear again and again and again so that people know that their voice is welcomed. On the margin, please speak up. Don't hold back. It's natural to hold back. Inviting engagement, well, that one's obvious. It's a stance of curiosity. It's a reminder to yourself that you may be missing something. Err on the side of curiosity. And finally, responding productively is a stance of empathy. It's understanding what people are up against and why it is so very challenging for them to keep on going in is finding that psychological safety, an environment where you feel you can bring your voice forward, does help to minimize burnout. Burnout is in part created when you feel you have to hide. So let's dig in, right? Many people have asked me during the COVID era, doesn't this make it more difficult to have psychological safety? Doesn't interpersonal fear take a nosedive? And the answer is not necessarily. Right? Interpersonal fear of the type we've been talking about is subtle, it's hidden, we don't discuss it, it's lonely, it's about what others think of you, and of course it inhibits innovation and resilience. But fear related to COVID, for example, is obvious, explicit, it's discussable, it's shared, and of course it's and then a capacity, individually and collectively, for frequent and rapid reflection. What you, all of you, must provide is clarity about facts, being honest, even when they are bad news. This is what we're up against. But don't forget to also provide hope. Right? There's a future in which we will prevail because of who you are and what you bring. And self-awareness, which helps you have an orientation toward others. It's not about you. It's about them. That empathy again, and reinforcing that you believe in them. Right? So this is a piece I wrote last January that just tries to drive this point home, that I am not saying, please no. I am not saying all fear is bad. I'm saying interpersonal fear is largely behavior. But productive fear, any real threat, any real danger, like a tiny virus, can be spontaneously challenged, and you start to think about resilience. You start to think about problem solving. So any fear that motivates teamwork and problem solving to make a positive difference can, in fact, be seen as productive. So we're now going to put you into some opportunities, into breakout groups to talk about these issues, and then we'll come back and have some opportunity for questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Amy. Gosh, I've just been scribbling notes all through your talk. Humility, curiosity, empathy. Nice to think we might all achieve those three things. So thank you so much for a really wonderful talk. I'm just going to ask someone to scroll up for me so I can see what the next announcement is. So, yeah, okay. So now what we're hoping is that those of you who want to continue the discussion after Amy's presentation, which I have to say really has left me wanting to, dig further into all of that. Selena Stevens is waiting for you in our Launch TV discussion room, and you can join her in a moment via the link in the conversation box on your screen. So Amy, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that talk. Don't forget our huddles will begin at around 20 minutes at 5 p.m. Central European Time today, and our closing session from Gary Kaplan will start at 5:30 p.m. So thank you all for being with us, and see you again tomorrow.